What happens to men who obey society without question? There's something unsettling about a man who has never questioned the world he was born into. He wakes up, follows the rules, checks the boxes, smiles when he's supposed to, nods when he's expected to, and goes to sleep believing he's done everything right. From the outside, he might look stable, conventional, even successful. But inside, something is dying, a slow erosion of soul, of will, of the unrepeatable essence that made him him. And the tragedy is, most men don't even know it's happening. They're too busy being what they were told to be, too busy obeying, too busy surviving within a system designed not to liberate them, but to use them. I want you to think about this. What does it mean to live a life of obedience without question? What happens to a mind that has never been allowed to rebel, even inwardly? What happens to a man who never asks why? Not just once, but every day. Because that's what we're talking about here. Not superficial disobedience, not rebellion for attention, but the deep, philosophical confrontation with the structure of reality you've been handed. The courage to look at your life, your job, your habits, your beliefs and say, who decided this? And why did I agree? Society, by design, rewards conformity. It has to. It's too large, too complex, too fragile to survive without mass obedience. And so it builds systems, schools, media, religion, corporate ladders not to awaken you, but to shape you. From the moment you're born, you're given a script. Be a good boy. Sit still. Learn this, memorize that. Get the grade. Get the diploma. Get the job. Get the mortgage. Get married, or have kids. Retire. Die. And if you follow the script, you're told you're doing well. But here's the catch. Doing well by society's standards often means dying by your own. Because society doesn't care about your soul. It cares about your utility. It wants you productive, predictable, profitable. It wants you working long hours, consuming endlessly, competing for status, and never asking whether any of it actually matters. That's why obedience is rewarded. Because obedient men keep the machine running. They don't ask why the machine exists. They don't ask if it should. They just pull the levers, pay their taxes, and sit quietly in traffic, wondering why they feel so numb.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
And here's the darkest part. Many of these men are not stupid. They're intelligent, talented, capable of greatness. But they've been trained to suppress their own questions in favor of comfort. They've traded meaning for stability. And over time, they forget that there was ever a choice. They become what I call the walking obedient, alive in body, but dead in spirit. They laugh when they're supposed to, but it's hollow. They talk about sports or politics or vacations, but never about truth, never about fear, never about what keeps them up at night. Because to speak that truth would be to admit that something is wrong. And to admit that something is wrong would mean they have to change. But change is terrifying when your entire life has been built on obedience. If you've spent 20, 30, 40 years doing what you were told, what happens if you realize you were lied to? What happens if you realize the ladder you've been climbing is leaning against the wrong wall? That's the existential crisis most obedient men avoid at all costs. They'd rather stay comfortable than be free, because freedom requires responsibility. It requires you to stop blaming the system and start building yourself. And that's hard. That's lonely. That's real. So let me ask you, are you truly living your life? Or are you living someone else's idea of what your life should be? Have you ever sat in stillness, no screens, no noise, no distractions, and asked yourself, what do I truly want? Not what would impress my parents, not what would look good on LinkedIn, not what would make me feel normal, but what would set my soul on fire. If you've never asked that, or worse, if you've asked it and ignored the answer, then you're not living. You're obeying, and the cost of obedience is not just personal, it's collective. Because when too many men obey without question, society itself becomes hollow. It loses its innovators, its rebels, its truth-tellers. It becomes a parade of masks, everyone playing roles, everyone pretending, no one feeling real. That's why art dies. That's why courage dies. That's why love becomes a transaction and conversation becomes a performance. Because no one is there. No one is home. Everyone is running on autopilot, hoping someone else will say what they're afraid to say. But here's the truth, no one is coming to wake you up. That's your job. And it starts with disobedience, not loud, angry rebellion, but the quiet, terrifying act of thinking for yourself. It starts when you stop asking, what should I do? And start asking, what is true? It starts when you stop living to be liked and start living to be whole. And if that costs you approval, so be it. If it costs you comfort, so be it. Because the alternative is to live a life so safe, so obedient, so normal that you never really lived at all. The silent collapse, how obedient men lose their souls without realizing it. There's no explosion, no dramatic breakdown, no public meltdown. The collapse of a man who obeys society without question is quiet, but it's internal, invisible. It happens slowly over years, sometimes decades, and by the time it's complete, the man himself doesn't even know it happened. He still gets up in the morning, still goes to work, still smiles politely in meetings, but inside, the light is gone. The passion is gone. The soul has quietly exited the building, leaving behind a shell that knows how to function, but not how to feel. This is the most dangerous kind of decay because it doesn't look like failure. It looks like success. The obedient man is often praised, but promoted, liked. He's the guy who always does what's expected, never makes waves, always delivers. But if you look closer, you'll see the signs. He can't remember the last time he felt alive. He can't name a dream that's truly his. He avoids silence because it reminds him of everything he's lost. And when he's alone, there's a heaviness, a quiet dread that he can't explain. That's the soul trying to speak through the cracks in the mask. Why does this happen? Because obedience without reflection is not virtue. It's anesthesia. It numbs the parts of you that are wild, curious, divine. And when those parts are silenced long enough, the body stays alive, but the spirit begins to rot. You stop asking big questions. You stop taking risks. You stop imagining new futures. You become a man of routine, of repetition, of reliability, but not of reality. Because the reality is, you've become a stranger to yourself. You've replaced authenticity with acceptability. You've traded your soul for security, and you didn't even read the fine print. And society encourages this. It rewards the collapse. It gives you titles, trophies, and tax breaks for playing the role well. But it never asks how you feel when you're alone. It doesn't care if you're fulfilled, it only cares if you're useful. And if you ever start to question that, if you ever start to wake up, you'll notice something strange. People get uncomfortable. They'll say you're having a crisis. They'll ask if you're okay. They'll suggest you take a vacation or get some help. Because your awakening threatens their sleep. Your questions threaten their obedience. But let's be brutally honest, the collapse is not always reversible. Some men never come back. They get too comfortable in the numbness. They build entire lives around their masked careers, families, identities. And the longer they wear it, the more terrifying it becomes to take it off. Because what if there's nothing underneath? What if the real self is too far gone? That's the fear that keeps men quiet, keeps them compliant. It keeps them pretending. But you're not watching this because you want to pretend. You're watching because something in you is still alive, still restless, still unwilling to go quietly into the grave of obedience. And that's everything. That's the spark and the beginning of return. Because the soul doesn't die all at once. It waits. It whispers. It leaves breadcrumbs in the form of longing, dissatisfaction, envy, dreams you can't shake. It's always trying to get your attention. The question is, are you listening? So let me ask you, what parts of you have gone quiet? What dreams have you buried beneath responsibility? What emotions do you avoid because they don't fit the image you're trying to maintain? These are not casual questions. These are invitations. Invitations back to yourself. Back to the life you were meant to live, not the one handed to you by culture, but the one written into your bones. Because here's the truth, you were not born to be a cog. You were not born to be a role. You were born to be. And being requires risk. It requires disobedience. It requires the willingness to disappoint others in order to be loyal to yourself. That's not selfish. That's sacred. And until you make that shift, until you prioritize your soul over your script, you will continue to decay. Quietly, respectably, tragically. But the moment you wake up, the game changes. And you begin to rebuild. First in discomfort, then in clarity, then in power. And one day, you'll look back at the version of you that obeyed without question, and you'll feel sorrow not because he was weak, but because he was asleep. And now, finally, you are awake. The rebellion of one. Why awakening is the most dangerous and beautiful thing a man can do. Awakening is not a gentle process. It doesn't come with soothing music or polite applause. It comes like a storm ripping through the illusions you've called home, tearing down the scaffolding of your old identity and leaving you exposed, uncertain and painfully alive. It is not comfortable. It is not safe. And that's exactly why most men avoid it. Because once you wake up, truly wake up, you can never go back. You can never unsee what you've seen. You can no longer play the obedient role with the same conviction. The mask no longer fits. The script no longer satisfies. And pretending becomes a form of spiritual violence. This is the rebellion of one. It doesn't require a crowd. It doesn't need a manifesto. It begins quietly, often invisibly, in the privacy of your own mind. It starts the moment you say, no more. No more living someone else's life. No more betraying your inner knowing to keep the peace. No more seeking permission to be yourself. It's a revolt against everything false, every belief, behavior, and obligation that doesn't reflect your deepest truth. And make no mistake, this rebellion comes at a cost. You will lose things. Friends, approval, certainty, You may even lose parts of your old self that once brought you pride. But what you gain in return is worth everything, your soul back. Most people will not understand this process. They will call it a phase. They will say you're being selfish, reckless, irrational. But they don't see what's happening beneath the surface. They don't feel the weight you've been carrying, the silent grief of a life unlived. They don't know what it's like to wake up in the middle of success and feel nothing. To have everything you were told to want and still feel empty. To realize that the ladder you climbed led to a rooftop with no sky. And here's the terrifying beauty of awakening. It doesn't give you new answers, it destroys the old ones. You suddenly realize that the system you obeyed was never designed for your liberation. That your value was measured by how well you fit in, not by how fully you became yourself. That your worth was tied to your productivity, not your presence. That your dreams were shaped by marketing, not meaning. And in that realization, something inside you breaks beautifully. The performance ends. The pretending stops. And for the first time you meet yourself not as a role, but as a man. So what happens next? That's where the real journey begins. Because rebelling against society is only the first step. The deeper rebellion is against your own conditioning, your own habits of self-abandonment, your tendency to shrink when you should rise, your addiction to approval, your fear of being misunderstood. Awakening means confronting all of it without flinching. It means becoming the kind of man who can stand alone not out of pride, but out of alignment. A man who doesn't need to dominate others because he's already mastered himself. And this mastery isn't loud. It doesn't shout. It doesn't seek validation. It simply is. It radiates from within. You feel it in the way you walk, the way you speak, the way you choose. You no longer move from fear, you move from clarity. You no longer chase worth, you express it. You no longer obey blindly, you discern. Every moment becomes a choice. Every action, a declaration, I belong to myself now. But let me warn you, awakening can be lonely, because most people are still asleep. They're still obeying the system, still chasing the script, still clinging to the mask. And when they see you stepping out, they may try to pull you back, not out of malice, but because your freedom threatens their comfort. Your truth reminds them of their silence. Your rebellion exposes their conformity. So here's the question: are you willing to be misunderstood? Are you willing to walk alone if it means walking in truth? Are you willing to let go of who you were to become who you really are? Because that's the cost. But that's also the reward. No one can give you freedom. No one can hand you your soul. That must be claimed through fire, through solitude, through relentless honesty. And when you do, when you finally stand in the center of your own being, unmasked, unowned, unafraid, you'll realize something astonishing. You were never meant to obey. You were meant to become. Becoming the architect, how to rebuild a life rooted in truth, not obedience. Once you've awakened, once the mask is off and the illusion is shattered, you stand in a strange, unfamiliar space. It's not freedom in the way most people imagine it. It's not a sudden rush of clarity or the instant arrival of purpose. No, it's emptier than that. It's vast, quiet, and disorienting. You've torn down the house that society built for you, but now you're staring at the bare foundation, and the terrifying realization hits: there's no blueprint anymore. You have to build it yourself. And this is where most men falter. Because tearing down is easy. Building your own life from nothing but truth, That's the heroic work. But if you've made it this far, if you've had the courage to disobey, to awaken, to let go, then you are ready. You don't need a map, you need integrity. The kind of integrity that doesn't bend to trends, doesn't seek applause, and doesn't outsource its compass. Your new life begins when you stop asking, "What should I do?" and begin asking, "What is true for me, even if no one understands?" That question will be your cornerstone. That's where the foundation of your real life is poured. And here's what you'll find: building from truth is slow, excruciatingly slow, because everything must be tested. Every belief, every habit, every relationship. You can't just assume anymore. You can't just follow the crowd. You now have to know what's real, and that means living it, not just thinking about it. You stop performing and start embodying. You stop chasing and start cultivating. And in this process, you'll lose the comfort of certainty, but you'll gain something far more powerful: alignment. Alignment is the new success. It's the feeling of moving through the world and knowing that your actions echo your values. That you are no longer split in two, one part performing, the other hiding. You are integrated, whole, and that wholeness radiates. People feel it, not because you're louder, but because you're clearer. You say no without guilt. You say yes without fear. You listen without needing to fix. You speak without needing to convince. You are rooted. Hey, but let's be honest, rebuilding in truth comes with challenges. You may have to walk away from relationships that were built on your obedience, not your authenticity. You may have to leave a job that pays well but starves your soul. You may have to disappoint people who only loved you when you were convenient. These are not easy decisions, but they are necessary. Because every time you compromise your truth to keep someone else comfortable, you reinforce the very system you escaped. So how do you build? You start with the small things. What do you eat? What do you read? Who do you spend time with? What conversations do you tolerate? What ideas do you allow into your mind? These aren't minor details. They are bricks. And brick by brick, you begin to construct a life that doesn't just look good from the outside but feels right on the inside. That's the goal. A life you don't have to escape from. A life that doesn't require a mask. A life that can hold your full truth without collapsing. Because here's the secret: when you build from truth, your life becomes a sanctuary, not just for you, but for others. You become a mirror, a lighthouse, a quiet rebellion. You don't need to preach. You don't need to convert. You just live, fully, honestly, deeply. And in doing so, you give others permission to do the same. So I'll leave you with this. What kind of life are you building right now? One that reflects your truth, or one that reflects your fear? Are you creating out of alignment or out of habit? Out of inspiration or out of obedience? Because the world doesn't need more obedient men. It needs builders, architects of presence, architects of truth. And that begins with one decision right now: to stop living the life you were told to live and start becoming the man you were born to be. And when you do that, when you choose to be the architect of your own existence, you don't just break free. You become free. Fully. Finally. Forever.